Hi everyone, welcome to this revision video for GCSE History, People's Health on the early modern period. In this video, we're going to talk about living conditions in the early modern period. We're also going to look at a case study of responses to the plague in the early modern period, and also look at the Great Plague in London of 1665. And then we're going to look at responses in terms of public health during the early modern period, and in particular, we're going to look at the gin craze. So let's find out more. So it's just a reminder of the key themes in terms of people's health, impact of living conditions, response to epidemics, improving public health, and then the key factors, beliefs, attitudes and values, local and national government, science and technology, urbanization, and wealth and poverty. So let's delve into the early modern period. So in terms of the specification, these are the things you need to know. So you need to know cultural, social and economic changes, including the growth of towns, overview of that. Changing living conditions. So for living conditions in early modern, you need to know about housing, food, clean water and waste. Responses to outbreaks of plague, including national plague orders and also local reactions. And then the impact of local and national government on public health, including measures to improve the urban environment and the government response to the gin craze. These are some key words that you'll come across for early modern people's health. An alderman, member of an English council, bubonic plague, cesspits, colonies, contagion, dearth, dunghills, dysentery, guilds, influenza, middling sort, plague doctor, raker, rates, typhus, and a water closet. Okay, so it's a good idea to know some key features of the early modern period just to place yourself within this time period. So in terms of farming and food, which were linked to living conditions, bad harvests could still lead to hunger, but by 1750, improvements to farming methods meant more people could be fed. There were a series of famines in the mid-1590s. There was some more in the 1620s, actually, which led to malnourishment and a little bit of starvation. But in a nutshell, you were much less likely to starve in the early modern period than you would in medieval times. Towns and trade, we have more urbanization. Towns definitely grow in size, become more crowded. Mines open in the northeast of England, and coal for people's fires was shipped to London. By 1750, new products such as sugar and tobacco were being traded. Due to the expansion of the empire, the East India Company and the slave trade. The Great Fire of London led to London being rebuilt after 1666. In terms of beliefs, attitudes and values, the country was still Catholic in 1500, but by 1750 it was Protestant. Most of the wealth of the church was taken by the government in the dissolution of the monasteries. The monasteries were closed down. Puritans did build almshouses, not alehouses. Puritans wouldn't have built alehouses. Puritans built almshouses for the poor, and old ideas like the theory of the four humours and miasma continued. Okay, so alcohol was a problem in the early modern period. Ale houses grew rapidly during the time period, and cheap alcohol from abroad, such as gin, meant that alcohol abuse became even more of an issue in society. In terms of technology, we had some new discoveries. People began to search for a scientific way of understanding the world in the so-called Renaissance, and in the 1660s, Robert Hooke developed a powerful microscope. The Renaissance led to a rebirth of learning and new discoveries, although these did not always have an immediate impact on people's health. A really important change actually took place at the end of the medieval period, but it's the printing press. But this was highly significant within the early modern period because it allowed new ideas and books and pamphlets to spread rapidly, and it enabled things to happen like the Elizabethan plague orders. Parliament had become more powerful than the monarch by 1750. Parliament began to make new laws that affected different aspects of people's lives, such as the Elizabethan Poor Law to help out with poverty during this time period. Now, during the early modern period, there was increased urbanization, with London becoming the largest and busiest city in Europe. The population rose from 120,000 in around about 1550 to 375,000 by 1650. Now, the Great Plague of 1665 hit the city of London hard. It killed between 70,000 and 100,000 Londoners, with 1,000 people dying a day at its height. So in terms of diet in early modern times, the diet for the rich, they ate large quantities of meat and fish. New food types from overseas trade and colonization, such as peppers, chilies, tomatoes and potatoes. They would eat white bread, which is not expensive, some fruit and vegetables. They would drink wine, ale, they would drink much more obviously than water. The rich actually enjoyed fine wine from France or Spain, and the rich enjoyed feasts and had banqueting houses to enjoy sugar treats. But it meant that the diet was about 80% protein, which led to some digestive problems, and some of the rich suffered from gout, which caused severe joint pain. In terms of diet for the poor, they ate bread, vegetables, pottage, occasional opportunities to eat eggs, cheese, fish and meat, particularly during religious festivals. This meant that diets of poorer people were in some ways healthier, but their diet lacked vitamin C and iron, which you would get from things like meat. There were periods of hunger and starvation due to bad harvests for the very poor. There was a widespread famine, 1623 to 1624, but generally famine was less common than medieval times. So in terms of similarity and difference, there's a few things there just to be aware of. In terms of diet in early modern times as well, richer families enjoyed exotic foods that were brought in from the Americas, including peppers, turkeys, chilies and tea and chocolate, of course. The religious custom of eating fish on Fridays continued in the early modern period. Early modern people also believed that what you ate affected your health. Some people believed eating fruit made you fart. Others thought fruit caused the plague. By 1750, there were over 500 coffee houses in London, and the increase in sugar in the diet led to bad teeth and obesity. Of course, Elizabeth I famously had terrible teeth from all the sugar she ate. Now, when you think about housing in early modern times, if you study the Elizabethans for OCRB, you'll be really familiar with Bess of Hardwick and the idea of the Elizabethan prodigy houses, and that enables the rich to live a life of luxury. So Bess of Hardwick, for example, built Hardwick Hall in 1597, lots of chimneys and glass. Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, and that compared very much to the homes of the poor, who were living pretty much in houses that were pretty much like medieval homes. So many of the poor lived in poor quality housing, which had changed little from medieval times. They were dark, cold and damp, with often only one room. There was no glass in the windows and no chimneys, making smoke fill the room. Like peasant houses, poor people's houses during this time would be very dark, for example, and not very nice at all. So rich people lived in grand Elizabethan prodigy houses, whereas the poor still lived in tiny cottages with little natural light. The rich had glass in their windows, whereas the poor had simple shutters over very small windows, no glass or chimneys. So though in some ways life seemed to be getting healthier, there were many health dangers lurking in the towns, and this is the key factor of urbanization. We've got the growth of London during this time, but we've got bigger towns during this early modern period as well. So meat sold at the market would rot very quickly. Animals roamed the streets, and animal poo could spread bacteria. Respiratory or lung diseases were caused by burning wood and coal in open fires. Coal was increasingly burned from the 17th century. All houses had an open fire, which created soot, dust and smoke, which people breathed in as they walked the streets. Accommodation was crowded and damp, and that resulted in breathing difficulties and lung problems as well. As towns grew, streets became more and more overcrowded. Many animals roamed the streets, like dogs, sheep and cats. There were also lots of rats, which would help bring about the many plague outbreaks during this period. Streets were unpaved and could become muddy tracks when it rained. Animal waste would mix in with the mud and rainwater. So we're just going to have a look at water supply in the early modern period and compare that between rich and poor. So in terms of water supply, in some towns companies piped water to houses, but that was very expensive. Water could also be bought from a water cellar. Now one big change was that in 1609 Hugh Middleton built a, quote, new river, bringing spring water 38 miles from the countryside outside London to a reservoir in Islington, supplying 30,000 homes in the city. People paid 4 times a year to be connected, but the water was still fairly dirty when you compare it to modern standards. In terms of poor people, they collected water from free public water fountains called conduits, or they bought water from a water cellar if they could afford to do so. But that was often not even really as any better really than the water they're getting from the conduits. In terms of keeping clean, for the rich people, servants washed clothes, bathtubs were used using water heated by fire so they could have baths, although they wouldn't obviously clean as much as, say, we would today. They also used soap, which was made from olive oil for use on the skin. Poor people would bathe in a river. They used brushes on their skin, which was known as dry washing, but the poor tended to be quite dirty and covered in lice, and that would lead to diseases like typhus, which is spread by lice. So in terms of similarity and difference, it's much easier for a rich person to stay clean than a poor person. A rich person could now benefit from cleaner piped water than a poor person. However, the piped water was nothing like as clean as our water today, but most people would still drink small beer, which was a weak ale during this time period. Yeah, and there's just a little picture of Hugh Middleton's reservoir, built in 1609 to bring water to London. In terms of dealing with waste in the early modern period, household waste, scavengers or rakers collected ash, food waste and sweepings from houses once or twice a week, and there were dung hills outside the towns. So household waste was effectively dealt with, and rakers sold the waste to market gardeners. In terms of wee and poo, urine and excrement, the flushing toilet was invented in 1596 by Sir John Harrington, but it only became popular towards the middle of the 18th century. The flushing toilet was very expensive and only for the very rich who had access to water and drains. Privies emptied into rivers if built nearby or over them. These are sometimes known as jakes. Most privies emptied into a cesspit, which often overflowed. Samuel Pepys, the diarist in the 1660s, complained of stepping into a, quote, great heap of turds, which leaked into his cellar from his neighbour's cesspit. Cesspits tended to be emptied every year or two by scavengers, which was very expensive, and poorer people emptied their own, created dunghills and back alleys and yards. So little change really from medieval times. Privies and cesspits polluted rivers and wells, and piles of excrement could build up in gardens, yards and alleyways, which spread disease. Okay, we're now going to look at response to epidemics, which for the early modern period is the Great Plague. Now, there were many outbreaks of plague in the years after 1348, particularly in towns. The plague increasingly becomes a disease of the towns. And in 1665, London suffered a devastating blow from the Great Plague, the most terrible outbreak of the disease, and was an epidemic. The Great Plague epidemic struck towns and villages in 1666 and 1667, and then never returned to England afterwards. This time period saw many significant changes in people's health and many examples of continuity. So people lived in fear of the plague until around the year 1667, when there was no more plague. And as we've seen, there were serious outbreaks of plague in this period, and it was mostly now a disease of towns, with the most serious one being in London, the Great Plague. And plague was terrifying because it was frequent, the symptoms were terrible, and many people died. It could kill around 10% of a community, sometimes as much as a third. People still did not know what caused the plague, so there is great continuity in people's approach to the plague. People still believed that disease was God's punishment for sin. The miasma theory was still accepted. Those miasma ultras are all around in the early modern period believing in miasma. By the end of the early modern era, scientists began to think that close contact or contagion with an infected person may be the real cause, but they did not fully understand why and still connected this with miasma. So plague, increasingly disease of towns, epidemics would hit once every 20 years or so, but the disease was not quite as severe as it had been in medieval times. So let's look at national responses to outbreaks of plague. Well, one of the first big things is to say that isolation increasingly becomes a key method of tackling the plague. This combined with plague orders made national government responses far more effective than they had been in medieval times. So in the year 1518, during the rule of Henry VIII, new rules were brought in to isolate plague victims in their own houses and identify them. Straw was hung outside infected houses to identify people, and anyone leaving the house had to carry a white stick. They also isolated people in pest houses outside the city walls. There was limited effectiveness as the orders were not enforced. In 1578, during the rule of Elizabeth I, there were plague orders. Now, there were 17 orders, including recording the spread of the disease, financial help for the sick, and burning of victims' clothing and bedding. Streets and alleys were to be cleaned thoroughly. No dogs, cats, pigeons allowed in the streets. Funerals at dusk to reduce those attending. Barrels of tar to be burned in the streets. That, of course, links with miasma. Plague sufferers and the healthy who lived in the same house were quarantined, isolated away from others for at least 6 weeks. Special prayers were said to ask for God's forgiveness. Now, this was effective in reducing the spread of the disease, although it isolated the healthy with the sick, and that was criticised at the time. The connection between dirt and disease was slowly being made, but no understanding of germs, but there was still the belief in God there. The responses were coordinated due to the plague orders. Now, the printing press is absolutely crucial for plague orders because these orders can be put up on paper and displayed around town so people know what they need to do. In 1604, during the rule of King James I, the Plague Act increased financial help for the families of the sick. City and town watchmen could use harsh punishments to enforce the policy of isolation, and there were harsher punishments imposed if a victim left isolation. A plague victim who left their house and mingled with other people could be hanged. So that's effective in terms of punishments, including death for those leaving isolation, and it reduced the spread of the disease as people stayed in isolation because the harsh punishments made isolation more effective. But people still did not know that plague was spread by fleas and rats. So by the early 17th century, there was more help and support being provided for the sick. This, combined with harsh punishments for breaking the rules, mirrored the Elizabethan approach to poverty, which we saw with the Elizabethan Poor Law if you've done the Elizabethans. Now, in terms of local government reactions were often more effective. In Yarmouth, the local authorities banned pigs, dogs and cats from infected streets. The village of Eyam in Derbyshire quarantined itself in 1665 to stop the spread of the plague to nearby Sheffield. 75% of the population of Eyam died, but it did save Sheffield from the plague. Some towns like Cambridge only allowed strangers into the city if they had a certificate of health, and many towns produced bills of mortality which were detailed records of plague deaths. And there's a plaque outside Rose Cottage in Eyam there where 9 members of the Thorpe family died from the plague in 1665. So how do individual people respond to the plague? Well, people go to church. In the early modern era, nearly everyone believed in God, so people prayed that God would take away the plague. People went to church, they lit candles and they used holy water, similar to the approach in medieval times. However, as England was now Protestant, they did not go on pilgrimage barefoot like they had done in medieval times. People ran away, and only the rich, though, could leave an infected town. Most people had to stay and deal with the disease as best they could. This was because more people believed in the idea of contagion, although they did not understand that germs cause disease. So people did try and stay away from others, and the rich would leave infected towns for the countryside. People tried to find a cure. There was no shortage of people claiming to have invented a cure. Plague doctors used sweet-smelling posies to fight against miasma. Smoking tobacco became more popular as people thought smoke tackled the miasma. And people used apothecaries to find potions to cure the plague. An apothecary is basically a place where you can get kind of medicines in the early modern period. People avoided the sick. It became a sensible option to avoid people who were contaminated. Sometimes there was racist attitudes and foreign immigrants were blamed for the plague. People did not usually abandon their families, though. They did stay together and prayed that they would survive. Now, another new thing in terms of treating the plague in the early modern period is the plague doctor would wear a black leather hat to show they were a doctor, red glass eyes to protect the wearer from evil and bad air. The beak was filled with sweet oils, petals and herbs to disguise bad air, such as rotting bodies, and there was a wooden stick to move dead bodies and examine living ones without having to touch them. Clothing made of waxed leather was used to cover as much of the doctor as possible to protect them from the disease. Okay, we're now going to look at the Great Plague in London in 1665 and look at approaches to treatment and attempts to stop its spread. So the plague returned to England throughout the 17th century. The Great Plague was the last major epidemic to hit England, and it came to England in 1665, and it actually killed 100,000 people in London. And across England, it's mainly confined to London, to be honest. What did people believe caused the Great Plague? Well, there is a lot of continuity in beliefs about what caused disease. People still believed in astrology and the alignment of the planets. They still believed it was a punishment from God to cleanse sins. There was still some people believing in the four humours. Still people believing in miasma, bad air from rotten food and waste. And the idea of person-to-person touch was a slightly kind of newer idea. So prevention and treatment of the plague, well, prayers were recited, but probably a big difference from what was happening with the Black Death in 1348 to 49 was that plague victims were quarantined for 28 days and the door was painted with a cross with the words, "Lord have mercy on us." So again, we've got that sense of religion there. People were encouraged to have a pomander, which is a ball containing perfumed herbs due to the bad air, the miasma. Fasting took place. Some people changed their diets, such as eating garlic. Plague doctors treated patients wearing a bird-like mask with sweet-smelling herbs inside to ward off miasma, and people smoked tobacco as well to ward off miasma. Prevention and treatment of the plague. There was a lot more done by the government to deal with the plague in 1665. If you think in 1348, we had this sort of rather weak order from King Edward III to clean up the streets, which actually 1349 he made the order. The Mayor of London published orders to deal with the plague. Now, this idea of plague orders had first come in during the rule of Elizabeth I, actually, in the late 16th century, but it's used a lot in 1665. And of course, having things like the printing press enabled plague orders to happen. So these are like orders that are printed and put up around the city to tell people what they should be doing. So it banned public meetings, funerals and fairs. Theatres, bear-baiting arenas and taverns, that's like a pub, were closed down. Streets were cleaned and barrels of tar were burned. Again, that's an approach for miasma. Stray cats and dogs were ordered to be killed. 40,000 dogs estimated and 200,000 cats were killed. Searchers were appointed to monitor the spread of disease and clear victims' bodies from towns. And the Mayor of London ordered watchmen to guard houses to make sure people stayed inside their houses during quarantines. Bills of mortality also kept records of who died in each parish and how they died, so the actual disease could be tracked, and of course that provides a brilliant source for historians to find out exactly what happened. Okay, now one thing to be aware of is that it was quite hard to enforce these plague orders. So this was partly because Parliament did not want to pass the laws, as members of the House of Lords did not want to get isolated in their homes. Many simply ignored the rules, so plague symptoms did not get reported. 20 watchmen in London actually got murdered by people escaping from their houses when they were under quarantine. King Charles II and his council left London. They discussed what to do about the plague just 3 times in 7 months, which kind of shows a lack of interest really from the king. Mostly they were concerned about the king's safety, not the people's. 9 men were put in charge of dealing with the plague, but 6 of them simply left London. It was hard to find people to be watchmen, and if they did, some people simply used it as an opportunity to steal from the sick, and many beggars and homeless people caught the plague, but they still stayed in the streets begging for help, so that would spread the plague further. And this picture just shows you some of the different responses they had to the plague in London in 1665, and obviously we've seen examples of all of those already. Okay, so one thing that's quite good to prepare for is to be able to compare dealing with the Great Plague in London, 1665, with what happened with the Black Death in 1348. So there are some similarities, ideas about causes, for example, punishment from God, imbalance of the 4 humours, miasma and astrology. We see that in both events. And prayers, preventions and treatments, things like prayers, going to church, lighting candles, and the fact there was some government action. So Edward III did order the Mayor of London to clean the streets in 1349. But there were some differences as well, some new ideas about causes. So person-to-person touch was believed in 1665, but really they had no clue what was actually causing the Great Plague in 1665. They still didn't know about germs. You know, the germ theory of disease is still going to be 200 years away. It's not discovered until 1861. But where there is a major difference is in the prevention and treatments. So we've got a lot more being done now. So we've got quarantine for 28 days, not really used in England formally in 1348. Smoking tobacco. Local authorities, the Mayor of London did much more, such as appointing viewers and searchers, the plague orders, doing things like banning public meetings, closing theatres and taverns. So that's the big difference really. Lots of similarities in causes, but lots of differences in terms of prevention and treatment. So we're now going to look at the impact of government on public health. So the first thing we're going to look at is local government in improving the urban environment. So in the 16th century, York was England's 3rd city, and the aldermen, the local officials of York, tried to keep the city clean. People in York were told to clean the areas outside their houses twice a week. People were not allowed to put waste out for scavengers until after 7 p.m. And there was a fine system in York for any household which threw human waste into the street at night. People were encouraged to empty cesspits. Nobody was allowed to block the gutters running down York's main street, and privies could not be built over the stream that ran through the city. And there's a picture of the shambles in York, and the shambles, the traditional place where the butchers were, and right in the middle there would be like an open sewer, open channel. They would take waste down to the river. So pretty disgusting really, to be honest. Okay, now plague outbreaks stopped after 1670 and towns improved mainly for the rich. So in London, water companies brought piped water into people's home, but only the rich could afford this. From 1670 to 1750, local authorities improved town centres. Large houses were built for the rich and streets were lit with oil lamps. London was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London of 1666. Streets began to be paved. So you can see an example of a typical street, Fenchurch Street in London, around about the year 1750. But conditions did not improve in the poorer areas of towns. Privies and cesspits and the health problems associated with them were a feature of life. The poor still had to collect water from a conduit. These changes were more about improving the urban environment and for civic pride than actually improving public health. Now, another big public health problem was alcohol. There was a huge increase in ale houses. From 1550, town authorities made it illegal to sell alcohol without a license. By the 1630s, attempts to control licenses had a real impact. Now, Puritans, strict Protestants, were against drinking alcohol. They made pamphlets like the one you can see there about the evils of alcohol. Pubs were closed down in the 1650s during the rule of Oliver Cromwell. If you've done the Elizabethans, you'll know that Puritans were, against kind of like alcohol and these kind of entertainments. If you've done the Merry England inquiry for Elizabethans. Rum was a byproduct of the slave trade and became popular in Britain. Sailors were given a daily ration known as a tot of rum. Porters, ales and Guinness were very popular by the mid-18th century. The ales were darker and stronger than traditional ale, but became popular. So people drank large quantities of alcohol, and that caused huge health problems. Now, in the early 18th century, the gin craze was a serious problem. From the 1660s, the gin craze meant that people were drinking spirits. In London, many dram shops, as they were known as, opened selling brandy and gin. Now, gin was initially imported from the Netherlands, but Parliament banned imports in 1689 to encourage distillers, people who make gin, in England. This led to gin becoming very cheap. Now, because gin was very cheap, it led to gin shops opening. Some people even sold it from barrows in the street. By the 1720s, gin was a social and health problem, with poor people turning to it for escapism. Gin shops advertised, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence. Thousands of gin shops opened in cellars, attics, back rooms, and even sheds. Gin was a cheap buzz which allowed the drinker to escape the harsh reality of their poverty-filled lives. Gin drinking led to an increase in crime, ruined families and increased the death rate, and many women as well as men became addicted to gin. Some women drank whilst pregnant, leading to birth deformities, and gin became known as the mother's ruin. Now, one story to be aware of is that in 1734 a woman called Judith Dufour killed her 2-year-old daughter Mary so she could sell her clothes to buy gin. So again, that reinforces the horrible social problems that gin was causing. Now, the artist William Hogarth was a strong critic of the gin craze and gin trade. In 1751, he produced his very famous engraving called Gin Lane, which gave a realistic and horrifying picture of the evils of gin. The image shows, of course, a thin soldier with a basket containing a bottle and a note that reads the downfall of gin. The slogan in the gin shop reads, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing, implying that people could die. And if you look at this image in the background, you can see absolute horrors of the gin kind of craze, and the buildings are all like in a sort of dilapidated state, and you can see there as well in the image a coffin kind of hanging down, reinforcing the idea that the coffin shops are doing well out of the gin trade. So how does the government tackle the gin craze? Well, it tries to take lots of different actions. Ale houses had to have a license in order to sell alcohol, but that only has limited effect as there were many smaller ale houses which were not regulated. People sometimes sold gin on the streets or in market stalls. The Gin Act of 1729 introduced a £20 licence fee for sellers and a 5s 25p tax per gallon for producers. The 1729 Act was impossible to enforce because of the huge number of small gin shops. The Gin Act of 1736 increased the licence fee to £50 and the producer's tax to 20 shillings. But the 1736 Act failed because of similar reasons to the 1729 Act. Rioting against this law there was, and many people began distilling gin in their own homes illegally. So this shows that how hard it was to actually act, to actually stop the gin craze, because people were ignoring the rules and just acting illegally. The Gin Act of 1743 restricted the sale of gin to ale houses, which already sold beer, ale and wine, but that had little impact. And by 1750, it's estimated that Londoners were drinking 11 million gallons of gin a year, which is a lot. Finally, though, the Gin Act of 1751 imposed really harsh punishments on anyone selling illegal gin. The 1751 Act worked, and consumption and the amount drunk fell. So the gin craze shows it was difficult for the government to enforce changes to public health. This was because many were addicted to alcohol, and it was really hard to enforce the laws. And remember, there was no police force during this time either. Okay, so thanks very much for listening to that GCSE history revision video on people's health and the early modern era. Hope you enjoyed that, hope it's been useful, and good luck with your exams. Bye bye.